The sinking of the SS Titanic, April 14th through the 15th, 1912. The SS Titanic of the White Star Line, largest ship the world had ever known, sailed from Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York on April 10th, 1912. She was built by Messrs. Harland and Wolff at Belfast. She was a fabricated steel vessel of gigantic dimensions, registered at Liverpool. Her gross tonnage was 46,328 tons. Her length overall being 852 feet, with a breadth of 92 feet and a depth of 65 feet. The distance from the keel to the top of the funnels was 175 feet. She had a double bottom extending the full length of the ship, with a space 5 to 6 feet between the inner and outer plates, and was divided into 6 watertight compartments, with access to each compartment through watertight doors. The rudder alone weighed 100 tons. She was driven by 3 enormous screws, the center one weighing 22 tons, the other two 38 tons each, and was capable of making 23 knots. The last word in luxury, she was thought to be unsinkable. Captain E.J. Smith, her commander, Commodore of the White Star Line fleet, was on his last round trip from Southampton before having to retire on age. In his 38 years of service, he had never met with a serious accident. On this trip, he had under him a splendid complement of officers and men. The Titanic had a passenger certificate to carry 3,547 passengers and crew. She carried 16 lifeboats and 4 Engelhardt collapsible boats, all of which had a total carrying capacity of 1,167 persons, or approximately 60 to 65 in each boat. She carried 3,560 life belts, or their equivalent. The Titanic was a wonderfully safe vessel. The life-saving equipment should surely have been sufficient to take care of any normal eventualities. On this maiden voyage, the ship carried a total of 2,208 persons, of whom 1,316 were passengers and 892 crew. There were 332 first-class passengers, 277 second-class passengers, and 709 third-class passengers. I have in my safe deposit box an original first-class passenger list. It was carried off the ship in the pocket of the overcoat worn by my mother. There were a great many prominent people on the passenger list, and because it was her maiden voyage, there were on board many of those responsible for the building of the ship and the management of the steamship line. Some of these were Thomas Andrews, one of the ship's designers, Archie Frost, the builder's chief engineer, including his approximately 20 assistants, J. Bruce Ismay, president of the International Mercantile Marine Company and chairman of the board and managing director of the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company Limited, owners of the White Star Line, all observing the performance of the ship, and all of whom were often with my father and myself during the few days we were aboard the ship. My father, John B. Thayer, second vice president of the Pennsylvania Railroad. My mother, Marion Longstreth Morris Thayer. My mother's maid, Margaret Fleming, and I were all in one party that sailed first class from Southampton. We had no more than started down the narrow channel and were commencing to make headway under our own power when we passed the American liner, the SS St. Paul, tied up to the SS Oceanic, which was lying alongside the dock. The suction created by our port propeller as we made a turn into the narrow channel broke the strong cables mooring her to the Oceanic, causing her stern to swing toward us at a rapid pace. It looked as though there would surely be a collision. Her stern could not have been more than a yard or two from our side. It almost hit us. Luckily, the combined effort of several tugs, which had quickly made fast to her, pulled her stern back. This narrowly averted collision was considered an ill omen by all those accustomed to the sea. We called at Cherbourg, and from there proceeded to Queenstown. We left Queenstown at 1:30 in the afternoon of Thursday, April 11th. The weather was fair and clear, the ship palatial, the food delicious. Almost everyone was counting the days till we would see the Statue of Liberty. I occupied a stateroom adjoining that of my father and mother on the port side of C deck, and needless to say, being 17 years old, I was all over the ship. Sunday, April 14th, dawned bright and clear. It looked as if we were in for another very pleasant day. I spent most of that day walking around the decks with my mother and father. We had short chats with many of the other promenaders, among whom I particularly remember J. Bruce Ismay, Thomas Andrews, and Charles M. Hayes, who was president of the Grand Trunk Railway of Canada, with all of whom we spent quite a lot of time. It became noticeably colder as the afternoon wore on. I remember Mr. Ismay showing us a wire regarding the presence of ice and remarking that we would not reach that position until around 9 p.m. We went to our staterooms about 6:30 to dress for dinner. My father and mother were invited out to dinner that night, so I dined alone at our regular table. After dinner, I was enjoying a cup of coffee when a man about 28 or 30 years of age drew up and introduced himself as Milton C. Long, son of Judge Charles M. Long of Springfield, Massachusetts. He was traveling alone. We talked together for an hour or so. Afterwards, I put on an overcoat and took a few turns around the deck. It had become very much colder. It was a brilliant starry night. There was no moon, and I have never seen the stars shine brighter. They appeared to stand right out of the sky, sparkling like cut diamonds. A very light haze, hardly noticeable, hung low over the water. I have spent much time on the ocean, yet I have never seen the sea smoother than it was that night. It was like a mill pond, and just as innocent looking as the great ship quietly rippled through it. I went on to the boat deck. It was deserted and lonely. The wind whistled through the stays, and blackish smoke poured out of the 3 forward funnels. The 4th funnel was a dummy for ventilation purposes. It was the kind of night that made one feel glad to be alive. About 11 o'clock, I went below to my stateroom. After a short conversation with my mother and father and saying good night to them, I stepped into my room to put on pajamas, expecting to have another delightful night's rest like the 4 preceding. The ship was so large and extensive that all I can tell about the tragedy is only a small part of all that actually occurred. I will try to recount all that I actually saw or heard from others and afterwards verified. We were steaming along at 22 or 23 knots, not reducing speed at all, in spite of the many warnings of the presence of ice which had come in from other ships during the afternoon and evening. We were out for a record run. I had called good night to my father and mother in the next room. In order to get plenty of air, I had half opened the port, and the breeze was coming through with a quiet humming whistle. There was the steady, rhythmic pulsation of the engines and screws, the feel and hearing of which becomes second nature to one after a few hours at sea. It was a fine night for sleeping, and with the day's air and exercise, I was sleepy. I wound my watch. It was 11:45 p.m. and was just about to step into bed when I seemed to sway slightly. I immediately realized that the ship had veered to port as though she had been gently pushed. If I had had brimful glass of water in my hand, not a drop would have spilled. The shock was so slight. Almost instantaneously, the engines stopped. The sudden quiet was startling and disturbing, like the subdued quiet in a sleeping car at a stop after a continuous run. Not a sound except the breeze whistling through the half-open port. Then there was the distant noise of running feet and muffled voices as several people hurried through the passageway. Very shortly, the engine started up again, slowly, not with the bright vibration to which we were accustomed, but as though they were tired. After very few revolutions, they again stopped. I hurried into my heavy coat and drew on my slippers. All excited, but not thinking anything serious had occurred, I called into my father and mother that I was going up on deck to see the fun. Father said he would put on his clothes and come right up and join me. It was bitterly cold. I walked around the deck, looking over the side from time to time. As far as I could see, there was nothing to be seen, except something scattered on the well deck forward, which I afterwards learned was ice. There was no sign of any large iceberg. Only 2 or 3 people were on deck when I arrived, but many rapidly gathered. Father joined me very soon. He and I moved around the deck, trying to discover what had happened, and finally found one of the crew who told us we had hit an iceberg, which he tried to point out to us, but which we could not see in spite of the brilliant night, as possibly our eyes were not accustomed to the dark after coming out of the lighted ship. The ship took on a very slight list to starboard. We did not know it at the moment, but we learned afterward that the iceberg had ripped open probably 4 of her larger forward compartments on the starboard side, and also that if we had only hit the ice head on instead of making too late at an attempt to avoid it, the ship would, in all probability, have survived the collision. About 15 minutes after the collision, she developed a list to port and was distinctly down by the head. Here we were 800 miles out from New York, off the Grand Banks. Our position, latitude 41 degrees, 46 minutes north, longitude 50 degrees, 14 minutes west. No one yet thought of any serious trouble. The ship was unsinkable. It was now shortly after midnight. My father and I came in from the cold deck to the hallway or lounge. There were quite a few people standing around questioning each other in a dazed kind of a way. No one seemed to know what next to do. We saw, as they passed, Mr. Ismay, Mr. Andrews, and some of the ship's officers. Mr. Andrews told us he did not give the ship much over an hour to live. We could hardly believe it. And yet, if he said so, it must be true. No one was better qualified to know. I was still just dressed in pajamas and overcoat. At about 12:15 a.m., the stewards passed the word around for everyone to get fully clothed and put on life preservers, which were in each stateroom. We went below right away, found my mother and her maid fully dressed. I hurried into my clothes, a warm greenish tweed suit and vest with another mohair vest underneath my coat. We all tied on the life preservers, which were really large, thick cork vests. On top of these, we put our overcoats. We then hurried up to the lounge on A deck, which was now crowded with people, some standing, some hurrying, some pushing out onto the deck. My friend Milton Long, he came by at the time and asked if he could stay with us. There was a great deal of noise. The band was playing lively tunes without apparently receiving much attention from the worried moving audience. It has been more or less definitively established by the investigations into the disaster held both in the United States and in England that the SS Californian passed the SS Titanic at about 12:30 a.m. and did see the distress rockets, which were continually sent up. She must have seen our blinker light, CQD, which was continuously operating. It was determined that her wireless operator signed off after talking to the Titanic at about 11:30 p.m., but possibly even heard our wireless CQD. The captain apparently paid no attention to any reports from his juniors. And while I did not see the masthead lights of the SS Californian, many claim they did see them. My mother watched them for some time while on the port side, waiting to get into a lifeboat, and Second Officer Lightaller told me he positively saw them. The ship was at the most not more than 10 or 12 miles away. By merely obeying the age-old law of the sea, the captain of the ship had the greatest opportunity ever presented to save over 1,500 human lives with the minimum of effort or danger to his own ship. We all went out onto A deck trying to find where we were supposed to go. They were then uncovering the boats and making preparations to swing them out. Everything was fairly orderly, and the crew at least seemed to know what they were doing. It was now about 12:45 a.m., and the noise was terrific. The deep, vibrating roar of the exhaust steam blowing off through the safety valves was deafening, in addition to which they had commenced to send up rockets. There was more and more action. After standing there for some minutes talking above the din, trying to determine what we should do next, we finally decided to go back into the crowded hallway where it was warm. Shortly, we heard the stewards passing the word around. All women to the port side. We then said goodbye to my mother at the head of the stairs on A deck, and she and the maid went out onto the port side of that deck, supposedly to get into a lifeboat. Father and I went out on the starboard side, watching what was going on about us. It seemed we were always waiting for orders, and no orders ever came. No one knew his boat position, as no lifeboat drill had been held. The men had not yet commenced to lower any of the forward starboard lifeboats, of which there were 4. And the noise kept up. The deck seemed to be well lighted. People like ourselves were just standing around out of the way. The stokers, dining room stewards, and some others of the crew were lined up, waiting for orders. The second and third class passengers were pouring up onto the deck from the stern, augmenting the already large crowd. Finally, we thought we had better inquire whether or not Mother had been able to get a boat. We went into the hall and happened to meet the chief dining room steward. He told us that he had just seen my mother and that she had not yet been put into a boat. We found her and were told that they were loading the forward boats on the port side from the deck below. The ship had a substantial list to port, which made quite a space between the side of the ship and the lifeboats, swinging out over the water, so the crew stretched folded steamer chairs across the space over which the people were helped into the boats. We proceeded to the deck below. Father, mother, and the maid went ahead of Long and myself. The lounge on B deck was filled with a milling crowd, and as we went through the doorway out onto the deck, people pushed between my father and mother and Long and me. Long and I could not catch up, and we were entirely separated from them. I never saw my father again. We looked for them, following along to where the port boats were being loaded, but could see nothing of either father or mother. Fully believing that they had both been successful in getting into a boat, Long and I went back through the lounge to the starboard side, thinking of what we should do and not looking further for my father at all. It must now have been about 1:25 a.m. The ship was way down by the head, with the water entirely covering her bow. She gradually came out of her list to port, and if anything, had a slight list to starboard. The crew had commenced to load and lower the forward starboard boats. These could hold over 60 people, but the officers were afraid to load them to capacity while suspended by falls, bow and stern, 60 feet over the water. They might have buckled or broken from the falls. The stern lifeboats, 4 on the port and 4 on the starboard side, had already left the ship. One of the first boats to leave carried only 12 people, Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon, and 10 others. Most of the boats were loaded with about 40 to 45, with the exception of the last few to go, which were loaded to full capacity. One could see the boats that had already left the ship, standing off about 500 or 600 yards. Apparently, there was only one light, about which most of them congregated. They were plainly visible and looked very safe on the calm sea. On deck, the exhaust steam was still roaring, the lights were still strong, and the band with life preservers on was still playing. The crowd was fairly orderly. Our own situation was too pressing, the scene too kaleidoscopic for me to retain any detailed picture of individual behavior. I did see one man come through the door out onto the dock with a full bottle of Gordon's gin. He put it to his mouth and practically drained it. If ever I get out of this alive, I thought, there is one man I will never see again. He apparently fought his way into one of the last 2 boats, for he was one of the first men I recognized upon reaching the deck of the SS Carpathia. Someone told me afterwards that he was a state senator or congressman for Virginia or West Virginia. There was some disturbance in loading the last 2 forward starboard boats. A large crowd of men were pressing to get into them. No women were around as far as I could see. I saw Ismay, who had been assisting in the loading of the last boat, push his way into it. It was really every man for himself. Many of the crew and men from the stokehole were lined up, with apparently not a thought of attempting to get into a boat without orders. Purser H.W. McElroy, as brave and as fine a man as ever lived, was standing up in the next to last boat, loading it. 2 men, I think, they were dining room stewards, dropped into the boat from the deck above. As they jumped, he fired twice into the air. I do not believe they were hit, but they were quickly thrown out. McElroy did not take a boat and was not saved. I should say that all this took place on A deck, just under the boat deck. Long and I debated whether or not we should fight our way into one of the last 2 boats. We could almost see the ship slowly going down by the head. There was just so much confusion. We did not think they would reach the water right side up, and so we decided not to attempt it. I do not know what I thought could happen, but we had not given up hope. We leaned over the side to watch the next to last boat being lowered. It was terrible. Apparently, for some seconds, there was no one above directing the lowering of the bow and stern falls so that she might be held level. The bow was lowered so fast that the people were almost dumped out into the water. I think if Long and I and others had not yelled up, "Hold the bow!" they all would have been spilled out. Finally, in a few minutes, she reached the water safely. It must now have been about 1:50 a.m., and as far as we knew, the last boat had gone. We were not aware of the fact that Second Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller and some of the crew were working desperately on top of one of the deck houses to free and launch one of the 4 Engelhart collapsible lifeboats. These boats had strong wooden bottoms with sides which could be raised, and all around the hull ran a canvas-covered cork fender with a curved surface. I argued with Long about our chances. I wanted to jump out and catch the empty lifeboat falls, which were swinging free all the way to the water's edge, with the idea of sliding down and swimming out to a partially filled boat lying off in the distance, for I could swim well. In this way, we would be away from the crowd and away from the suction of the ship when she finally went down. We were still 50 or 60 feet above the water. We could not just jump, for we might hit wreckage or a steamer chair and be knocked unconscious. He argued against it and dissuaded me from doing so. Thank heaven he did. The temperature of the water was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees below freezing. We then went up a sheltered stairway onto the starboard side of the boat deck. There were crowds of people up there. They all seemed to keep as far as possible from the ship's rail. We stood there talking from about 2 a.m. on. We sent messages through each other to our families. At times, we were just thoughtful and quiet, but the noise around us did not stop. So many thoughts passed so quickly through my mind. I thought of all the good times I had, and of all the future pleasures I would never enjoy, of my father and my mother, of my sisters and brother. I looked at myself as though from some far-off place. I sincerely pitied myself. It seemed so unnecessary, but we still had a chance, if only we could keep away from the crowd and the suction of the sinking ship. I only wish I had kept on looking for my father. I should have realized that he would not have taken a boat, leaving me behind. I afterwards heard from my friend, Richard Norris Williams, the tennis player, that his father and mine were standing in a group consistent of Mr. George D. Widener and his son Harry, together with some others. They were close in under the second funnel, which was very near to where Long and I were. It was now about 2:15 a.m. We could see the water creeping up the deck as the ship was going down by the head at a pretty fast rate. The water was right up to the bridge. There must have been over 60 feet of it on top of the bow. As the water gained headway along the deck, the crowd gradually moved with it, always pushing towards the floating stern and keeping in from the rail of the ship as far as they could. We were a mass of hopeless, dazed humanity, attempting, as the Almighty and nature made us, to keep our final breath until the last possible moment. The roaring of the exhaust steam suddenly stopped. making a great quietness in spite of many mixed noises of hurrying human effort and anguish. As I recall it, the lights were still on even then. There seemed to be quite a ruddy glare, but it was a murky light, with distant people and objects vaguely outlined. The stars were brilliant, and the water oily. Occasionally there had been a muffled thud or deadened explosion within the ship. Now, without warning, she seemed to start forward, moving forward and into the water at an angle of about 15 degrees. This movement with the water rushing up towards us was accompanied by a rumbling roar mixed with more muffled explosions. It was like a standing under a steel railway bridge while an express train passes overhead, mingled with the noise of a pressed steel factory and wholesale breakage of china. Long and I had been standing by the starboard rail, about abreast of the second funnel. Our main thought was to keep away from the crowd and the suction. At the rail, we were entirely free of the crowd. We had previously decided to jump into the water before she actually went down, so that we might swim some distance away and avoid what we thought would be a terrific suction. Still, we did not want to jump before the place where we were standing would be only a few yards away from the water, for we might be injured and not be able to swim. We had no time to think, only to act. We shook hands, wished each other luck. I said, "Go ahead, I'll be right with you." I threw my overcoat off as he climbed over the rail, sliding down facing the ship. 10 seconds later, I sat on the rail. I faced out, and with a push of my arms and hands, jumped into the water as far out from the ship as I could. When we jumped, we were only 12 or 15 feet above the water. I never saw Long again. His body was later recovered. I am afraid that the few seconds elapsing between our going meant the difference between being sucked into the deck below, as I believe he was, or pushed out by the backwash. I was pushed out and then sucked down. The cold was terrific. The shock of the water took the breath out of my lungs. Down and down I went, spinning in all directions, swimming as hard as I could in the direction which I thought to be away from the ship. I finally came up with my lungs bursting, but not having taken any water. The ship was in front of me, 40 yards away. How long had I been swimming underwater? I don't know. Perhaps a minute or less. Incidentally, my watch stopped at 2:22 a.m. The story would not be complete without comment on the discipline and behavior of the crew. They were perfect and did their full and complete duty. To see all the men covered with dirt and grime of the boiler room, after having drawn the fires from the flooded stokehole, lined up on deck awaiting orders, was a grand, inspiring sight. It was a tribute to the British Mercantile Marine. Not a single engineering officer or engineer of the ship was saved. Everyone was at his post in the engine room. They kept the lights going till the ship went down. They made the power for the CQD, which called for help through the night. think what panic we might have had if the lights had failed, or worse yet, if the SS Carpathia had been unable to hear our call and learn our position. Besides the full complement of engineers on the ship, headed by Chief Engineer William Bell, there were Archie Frost, Harland and Wolff's chief engineer, and about 20 assistants, together with Mr. Thomas Andrews, one of the designers of the ship. Every single one died attending to his duty without a chance of being saved. The ship seemed to be surrounded with a glare and stood out of the night as though she was on fire. I watched her. I don't know why I didn't keep swimming away. Fascinated, I seemed, tied to the spot. I was tired out with the cold and struggling, although the life preserver held my head and shoulders above the water. She continued to make the same forward progress as when I left her. The water was over the base of the first funnel. The mass of people on board were surging back, always back towards the floating stern. The rumble and roar continued, with even louder, distinct wrenchings and tearings of boilers and engines from their beds. Suddenly, the whole superstructure of the ship appeared to split, well forward to midship, and blow and buckle upwards. The second funnel, large enough for 2 automobiles to pass through abreast, seemed to be lifted off, emitting a cloud of sparks. It looked as if it would fall on top of me. It missed me by only 20 or 30 feet. The suction of it drew me down and down, struggling and swimming, practically spent. As I finally came to the surface, I put my hand over my head in order to push away any obstruction. My hand came against something smooth and firm with rounded shape. I looked up and realized that it was the cork fender of one of the collapsible lifeboats, which was floating in the water bottom side up. About 4 or 5 men were clinging to her bottom. I pulled myself up as far as I could, almost exhausted, but could not get my legs up. I asked them to give me a hand, which they readily did. Sitting on my haunches and holding on for dear life, I was again facing the Titanic. It seemed as though hours had passed since I left the ship, yet it was probably not more than 4 minutes, if that long. There was the gigantic mass about 50 or 60 yards away. The forward motion had stopped. She was pivoting on a point just abaft of midship. Her stern was gradually rising into the air, seemingly in no hurry, just slowly and deliberately. The last funnel was about on the surface of the water. It was the dummy funnel, and I do not believe it fell. Some months after the disaster, however, I had been invited to tell my story of the behavior of the ship to the engineers and ship designers of the William Cramp and Sons Ship and Engine Building Company, Richmond and Norris Streets, Philadelphia. I described the action in this way. The iceberg cut open about 4 of the Titanic's forward compartments, leaving possibly at least 1 buoyant compartment in the bow intact, with the buoyant stern tending to rise and the bow tending slightly to do the same. The weight of the engines and boilers, which, torn from their beds, crashed in midship, possibly broke the keel downwards, and this in turn forced the superstructure to buckle or push up at the forward expansion joint, causing the funnel to fall. I did not say she broke into separate parts, but that some bending and breaking did take place. My hearers told me that it was a reasonable supposition and a possible explanation of the final behavior of the ship. Her deck was turned slightly towards us. We could see groups of the almost 1,500 people still aboard, clinging in clusters or bunches like swarming bees, only to fall in masses, pairs or singly, as the great after part of the ship, 250 feet of it, rose into the sky till it reached a 65 or 70-degree angle. Here it seemed to pause and just hung for what felt like minutes. Gradually, she turned her deck away from us, as though to hide from our sight the awful spectacle. We had an oar on our overturned boat. In spite of several men working it, amid our cries and prayers, we were being gradually sucked in towards the great pivoting mass. I looked upwards. We were right underneath the 3 enormous propellers. For an instant I thought they were sure to come right down on top of us. Then, with the deadened noise of the bursting of her last few gallant bulkheads, she slid quietly away from us into the sea. There was no final apparent suction, and practically no wreckage that we could see. I don't remember all the wild talk and calls that were going on our boat, but there was one concerted sigh or sob as she went from view. Probably a minute passed with almost dead silence and quiet. Then an individual call for help, from here, from there, gradually swelling into a composite volume of one long, continuous wailing chant from the 1,500 in the water all around us. It sounded like locusts on a midsummer's night in the woods in Pennsylvania. This terrible, continuing cry lasted for 20 or 30 minutes, gradually dying away as one after another could no longer withstand the cold and exposure. Practically no one was drowned, as no water was found in the lungs of those later recovered. Everyone had on a life preserver. The partially filled lifeboats standing by, only a few hundred yards away, never came back. Why on earth they did not come back is a mystery. How could any human being fail to heed those cries? They were afraid the boats would be swamped by people in the water. The most heart-rending part of the whole tragedy was the failure, right after the Titanic sank, of those boats which were only partially loaded to pick up the poor souls in the water. There they were, only 400 or 500 yards away, listening to the cries, and still they did not come back. If they had turned back, several hundred more would have been saved. No one can explain it. It was not satisfactorily explained in any investigation. It was just one of the many acts of God running through the whole disaster. During this time, more and more were trying to get aboard the bottom of our overturned boat. We helped them on until we were packed like sardines. Then, out of self-preservation, we had to turn some away. There were finally 28 of us, all together on board. We were very low in the water. The water had roughened up slightly and was occasionally washing over us. The stars still shone brilliantly. We were standing, sitting, kneeling, lying in all conceivable positions in order to get a small hold on the half-inch overlap of the boat's planking, which was the only means of keeping ourselves from sliding off the slippery surface into the icy water. I was kneeling. A man was kneeling on my legs with his hands on my shoulders, and in turn, somebody was on him. Once we obtained our original position, we could not move. The assistant wireless man, Harold Bride, was lying across in front of me with his legs in the water and his feet jammed against the cork fender, which was about 2 feet underwater. We prayed and sang hymns. A great many of the men seemed to know each other intimately. Questions and answers were called around. Who was on the board, and who was lost, or what they had been seen doing. One call that came around us was, "Is the chief aboard?" Whether they meant Mr. Wilde, the chief officer, or the chief engineer, or Captain Smith, I don't know. I do know that one of the circular life rings from the bridge was there when we got off in the morning. It may be that Captain Smith was on board with us for a while. Nobody knew where the chief was. About 20 of our whole group were stokers. How they ever withstood the icy temperature after the heat they were accustomed to is extraordinary. But there was no case of illness resulting. They surely were grimy, wiry, disheveled, hard-looking lot. Under the surface, they were brave human beings with generous and charitable hearts. Second Officer Lightoller, I discovered in the morning, was on board. He and some of the crew were trying to launch this boat before the Titanic sank. They were unsuccessful, but she floated off the deck, covered with people, all of whom were shortly after washed off. Lightoller himself was washed off and sucked up against one of the ventilator grills. He had a terrific struggle, but finally again was able to reach the boat. In August 1914, just as war declared, I sailed on the SS Oceanic from New York to play cricket in and around London on a Marion Cricket Club team. Lightoller was either chief officer or first officer of the Oceanic, I'm not certain which. We again went over our experiences and checked our ideas of just what had happened. We agreed on almost everything, with the exception of the splitting or bending of the ship. He did not think it broke at all. Only 4 of us were passengers. Colonel Archibald Gracie, Washington, D.C. A.H. Barkworth, East Riding, Yorkshire, England. W.J. Mellors, Chelsea, London, England. And myself. Harold Bride helped greatly to keep our hopes up. He told us repeatedly which ships had answered his CQD, at that time the Morse code for help, and just how soon we might expect to sight them. He said time and time again, in answer to despairing doubters, "The Carpathia is coming up as fast as she can." I gave her our position. There is no mistake. We should see her lights at about 4 or a little after. During all this time, nobody dared to move, for we did not know at what moment our perilous support might overturn, throwing us all into the sea. The buoyant air was gradually leaking from under the boat, lowering us further and further into the water. Sure enough, shortly before 4 o'clock, we saw the masthead light of the Carpathia come over the horizon and creep towards us. We gave a thankful cheer. She came up slowly, oh, so slowly. Indeed, she seemed to wait without getting any nearer. We thought hours and hours dragged by as she stood off in the distance. We had been trying all night to hail our other lifeboats. They did not hear us or would not answer. We knew they had plenty of room to take us aboard if we could only make them realize our predicament. The Carpathia, waiting for a little more light, was slowly coming up on the boats and was picking them up. With the dawn breaking, we could see them being hoisted from the water. For us, afraid we might overturn any minute, the suspense was terrible. The long hoped-for dawn actually broke, and with it a breeze came up, making our raft rock more and more. The air under us escaped at a more rapid rate, lowering us still further into the water. We had visions of sinking before the help so near at hand could reach us. With daylight, we could see what we were doing and took courage to move, stretch, and untangle ourselves. One by one, those on top of the freezing group stood up, until all of us who could stand were on our feet, with the exception of poor Bride. He could not bear his weight on his, but could only pull his feet and legs slightly out of the water. The waves washed over the upturned bottom more and more. As we sank lower and the water became rougher, to keep our buoyancy, we tried to offset the roll by leaning all together first to one side and then to the other. At 6:30, after continued and desperate calling, we attracted the attention of the other lifeboats. 2 of them finally realized the position we were in and drew towards us. Lightaller had found his whistle, and more because of it than our hoarse shouts, their attention was attracted. It took them ages to cover the 300 or 400 yards between us. As they approached, we could see that so few men were in them, that some of the oars were being pulled by women. In neither of them was much room for extra passengers, for they were 2 of the very few boats to be loaded to near capacity. The first took off half of us. My mother was in this boat, having rowed most of the night. She says she thought she recognized me. I didn't see her. The other boat took aboard the rest of us. We had to lift Harold Bride. He was in a bad way, and I think would have slipped off the bottom of our overturned boat if several of us had not held on to him for the last half hour. It was just about this time that the edge of the sun came above the horizon. Then to feel its glowing warmth, which we had never expected to see again, was something never to be forgotten. Even through my numbness, I began to realize that I was saved, that I would live. The Carpathia was about 800 yards away, picking up the people from one boat after another as fast as she could. Gradually, we drew alongside of her. There was a rope ladder with wooden steps hanging down by her side. Most of us climbed up it, although many had to be hauled up in slings or chairs. It was now almost 7:30 a.m. We were the last boat to be gathered in. The only signs of ice were 4 small, very scattered bergs way off in the distance. As I reached the top of the ladder, I suddenly saw my mother. When she saw me, she thought, of course, that my father must be with me. She was overjoyed to see me, but it was a terrible shock to hear that I had not seen Father since he had said goodbye to her. As we talked, somebody gave me a coffee cup full of brandy. It was the first drink of an alcoholic beverage I had ever had. It warmed me as though I had put hot coals in my stomach, and did more too. A man kindly loaned me his pajamas and his bunk. Then my wet clothes were taken to be dried, and with the help of the brandy, I went to sleep till almost noon. I got up feeling fit and well, just as though nothing bad had happened. After putting on my clothes, which were entirely dry, I hurried out to look for Mother. We were then passing to the south of a solid ice field, which I was told was over 20 miles long and 4 miles wide. I found that Captain Arthur H. Rostron, commander of the Carpathia of the Cunard Line, had given up his cabin to my mother, Mrs. George D. Widener, and Mrs. John Jacob Astor. I slept on the floor of the cabin every night until we reached New York on Thursday evening, April 18th. The passengers and crew of the Carpathia were wonderfully good to us, looking to our every need and comfort. Enough can't be said to describe the bravery of Captain Rostron in his taking the tremendous responsibility of running through that dense ice field full speed ahead to our rescue. The trip back to New York was one big heartache and misery. There were 705 survivors on board, 1,503 having been lost. It seemed as if there were none but widows left, each one mourning the loss of their husband. It was a most pitiful sight. All were hoping beyond hope, even for weeks afterwards, that some ship somehow had picked up their loved one, and that he would be eventually among the saved. Because I had known Ismay so well on board the Titanic, the doctor of the Carpathia, the afternoon that we approached New York, asked me if I would visit Mr. Ismay in his cabin and talk to him, to see if I could not help relieve the terribly nervous condition he was in. I immediately went down, as there was no answer to my knock. I went straight in. He was seated, in his pajamas, on his bunk, staring straight ahead, shaking all over like a leaf. My entrance apparently did not dawn on his consciousness. Even when I spoke to him and tried to engage him in conversation, telling him that he had a perfect right to take the last boat, he paid absolutely no attention and continued to look ahead with his fixed stare. I am almost certain that on the Titanic his hair had been black with slight tinges of gray, but now his hair was virtually snow white. I have never seen a man so completely wrecked. Nothing I could do or say brought any response. As I closed the door, he was still looking fixedly ahead. The final docking in New York, at Pier number 54, North River, when all our friends and relations learned the truth about the extent of the loss, was the last nerve-shattering blow for many people. For those who were ashore, it marked the end of all hope. With the exception of lawsuits and investigations, it was the closing chapter of the greatest and most distressing disaster of the sea. that the world has yet seen.